Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my top 10 decks currently in the Pokemon TCG. With Paradox Rift out, the Pokemon TCG format has changed quite a bit, and today I'm going to be going over my current best decks. We're going to start at number 10 and then work all the way up to number 1. If you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. All right, let's hop into it. Coming in at number 10 here, we have Entei V Iron Valiant EX. This is the deck that most recently got second place at the Latin American International Championships, and it surprised a lot of us. But when you look at it, this deck actually makes a lot of sense. Entei V is a relatively powerful Pokemon with that Burning Rondo, which deals a decent amount of damage. It's been a card that has been around for quite some time, but with the power creep in the Pokemon TCG, it just often seemed to be just a little bit short from taking those knockouts. Now with Iron Valiant EX's Tachyon Bits ability being able to put lots of damage on the board, Burning Rondo actually becomes a very, very respectable attack. Paired up with other powerful cards like Medicham, you're able to take multiple prize cards in one turn and take over the game with its early game aggression. This is going to be the list that Kaiwin Kababe used to get top 16 at the most recent Brisbane Regional Championships, and I think that this deck is really powerful. My only concern with this deck is as people begin to adapt to it, things like Jirachi I think are going to cause some issues, as Jirachi prevents things like Medicham V's Yoga Loop from being able to be used. So I think this deck came to a big surprise to people, and people weren't necessarily 100% sure how to play against it. However, as time goes on, I think people will, kind of begin to adapt to it, and I think the deck might struggle a little bit as the format starts to move towards a more unfavorable position for the deck as people begin to try and counter it. However, I do think the deck is very strong. One of the more early game consistent decks in the format. Goal is kind of just to run your opponent over with that early game aggression. But you also have things like Radiant Charizard as well, which is a fantastic finisher, being able to use Combustion Blast to deal 250 damage, which is able to knock out a lot of things in the standard format. Overall, this deck is really cool and I think has a lot of potential. However, I do think that this deck might have already peaked at the most recent LAIC. Getting second place at an IC is definitely not an easy feat, and I think that might be the peak for the deck as of right now. Maybe, though, the deck will prove me wrong. Overall, it's still a respectable deck in the standard format, and I think makes a solid choice moving forward. Alrighty, hopping into number 9 here, we have Lost Zone Giratina V-Star. This is a deck that remains near the top of the metagame, performing relatively well at tournaments, and it just in general is a very, very solid deck. Its Lost Impact and Star Requiem are incredibly powerful attacks. Star Requiem, one of the most powerful attacks in the game, being able to knock out anything in the opponent's active spot, as long as you have 10 cards in the Lost Zone and you have great support with things like Sableye, Radiant Greninja, and Cramorant. Overall, this deck I think is still very, very powerful. The one thing that consistently holds it back is its consistency, and especially now with cards like Jirachi beginning to roam around in decks, basically making Sableye useless. I do have some concerns with just the Lost Zone engine in general, specifically Lost Zone Giratina V-Star. As time has gone on, we've seen a lot of Lost Zone decks begin to adapt, adding in things like Iron Hands, Roaring Moon. We've even seen decks, bringing back the Radiant Charizard as well. And Giratina pretty much remains the same. There's not necessarily a whole lot to add to it. So pretty much everyone kind of knows kind of how to play versus Giratina, what its strategies are and stuff like that. And I feel like any competent player can definitely put together a game plan versus this deck. And I think that's one thing that is, going to hold it back, I think, from consistently performing well at tournaments. But I do think that it's definitely going to spike a few events just because of how powerful that Giratina V-Star is. It has decent matchups against plenty of things in the format. However, as I said, if things begin to add in Jirachi, not being able to use Sableye is a big problem. For example, matchups like Gardevoir and Charizard without the Jirachi are actually relatively solid matchups for Giratina. However, if both of those decks begin to add those in, not being able to use Sableye causes a lot of issues for those matchups. So I would say that as of right now, the deck is solid, but if people begin to add in, Jirachis, this deck will potentially fall off. However, if we're entering a format where Jirachi is not a very good card or just not played a whole lot, then I definitely think that this deck has a lot of potential. Giratina V-Star, still very, very respectable. Alrighty, hopping into number 8 here, we have Chen-Pao Iron Hands. Chen-Pao Iron Hands is the ultimate glass cannon deck currently in the standard format. When it sets up, it's pretty much unbeatable. However, that is easier said than done. You sometimes just run into these hands where you're not entirely sure what to do with them just because they're a just conjumbled mess of cards in the wrong order, and this deck can sometimes run into those, inconsistency issues. I think the deck, when it does get set up, has potential to be anything. It has arguably the highest ceiling out of any deck in the standard format, aside from Gardevoir. When it gets set up, it just has decent matchups against everything. However, as I said, that can sometimes be difficult to do. You do have the 2-2 barrel with that Industrious Incisors, which helps that consistency throughout the game. You have things like Radiant Greninja as well to burn through your deck, trying to build those big hands to be able to use that Hail Blade over and over again. The Iron Hands EX as well adds some nice depth to the deck, being able to have better matchups against those one prize decks, specifically things like Gardevoir and Lost Zone Toolbox become significantly better matchups. The Iron Bundle is also a pretty interesting card in the deck that some notable players like Azul, GG, Caleb Gettimer, and a few others decided to play this to the Latin American International Championships. And pretty much how the card works is when you put it onto the bench, you're able to put it into the discard and your opponent has to switch their active. So you can use the Iron Bundle to force up something that Iron Hands can knock out, and if they expect Iron Hands, then they might put up a high HP Pokemon, which then you can use the Chen-Pao to KO. So you kind of put them in a lose-lose situation. In a lot of ways, when you use the Iron Bundle, you force them, potentially to give up a 2-prizer or put up a 1-prizer that can get knocked out by Iron Hands. So that's a really cool card in the deck and does add, a little bit of spice to it, which I think is really, really cool. Other than that, one notable thing is I don't have cross switchers currently in the list. I think that consistency is really important with this deck, and added in cross switchers, you have to cut, a couple consistency cards. So that was one thing that I was a little bit concerned about. So I decided to just go with the Counter Catcher, Escape Rope, and Iron Bundle. But it's a very, very good deck when it sets up. However, that is the big question mark. When it gets going, it's one of the most powerful decks in the format. Alrighty, hopping to number 7 here, we have Rapid Strike Urshifu Vmax Inteleon Vmax. This is a deck that wasn't getting much of the spotlight right when Paradox Rift came out. People were focusing on decks like Iron Valiant, just other spread decks in general, and this deck didn't really get a whole lot of love. But as the format has begun to develop, players have begun to realize just how powerful this deck is. Gaining the Technical Machine Devolution is really, really powerful, and it allows you to make matchups like Charizard, make matchups like Gardevoir exceptionally good. If they do not play things like Giratina, you'll be able to wipe their board with things like Medicham, Technical Evolution, things like Double Gunner as well, and Alakazam. You're just able to control the board against so many evolution-based decks. One of the things, though, unfortunately holding this deck back, a little bit similar to something like Lost Zone Giratina, is its consistency can be relatively shaky at times. And if more players begin to add in Giratina, not having that ability to use something like Medicham V can definitely cause some problems. Overall, though, I think it's a really powerful deck as of right now. And with so many evolution-based decks in the format, it is in a pretty healthy spot. Overall, this deck is really, really good. I believe this was the list or similar to the list that Rahul Reddy used to get top 16 at the Poland Regional. So shout out to them for kind of showcasing the deck is still, really, really powerful. But yeah. All right. Number 7, Rapid Strike Urshifu Inteleon. Strong deck as always. All right, moving on to number 6 here, we have the Lost Zone Toolbox engine in general. I'm going to also include Lost Zone Radiant Charizard Roaring Moon. That has also been seeing some success as well. This is going to be the list that Tor Reklev used to get top 8 at the most recent Poland Regionals and Gdansk. Very, very cool deck, and I think it's actually really strong. I just think Lost Zone in general is a lot better than people think. I think a lot of people, were just kind of thinking that, Giratina and Iron Hands were going to kill the deck. Iron Hands isn't necessarily played in a high amount of decks currently in the standard format. Pretty much just decks like Miraidon. Lugia is not necessarily super popular, and then, other things, like some Lost Zone engines and stuff like that. and some Chen-Pao lists have it in. So not necessarily every deck is playing Iron Hands, and most decks aren't playing, I would say, Jirachi as of right now. I think it's kind of, 60 to 70% of decks aren't playing Jirachi, and only about 30 to 40% are. So Sableye and stuff like that is still a very, very powerful card in the format. And you now also have a lot of other really cool cards to go with it. You have things like Roaring Moon and Iron Hands that are easily power upable with the Mirage Gate, and you also have Palkia V-Star, which is a great counter to Entei V, which has been roaming the standard format after its very successful placement at LAIC. So this deck pretty much has everything. It has the Kyogre engine, it has Roaring Moon, it has Iron Hands for those one prize matchups, and it also now has Palkia for that Entei matchup. So this deck is really good. When it sets up, it has outs to mostly everything. It can be a little bit slow at times and not necessarily having room for things like Lost Vacuum, because you have to commit so many spots to these other tech cards. You are a little bit naturally of a slower Lost Zone engine, which can sometimes, you can sometimes run into problems when you're trying to push for that turn to, Frenzied Gouging, or that turn to, amp you very much. So that is one thing that kind of concerns me with the deck. So if you are able to find room for maybe one or two Vacuum, then that definitely might be something that you want to consider. But overall, Lost Zone engine is still very powerful, and this list, I think, has a chance at beating most things in the standard format. Lost Zone seems to never die. Moving on to number 5, we have the dreaded Stall. Stall is a deck that some people love, some people hate. Definitely a very, very controversial deck right now in the Pokemon TCG, but there's no doubt that it is one of the more powerful decks currently in the standard format. Your goal is to not take any prize cards. Your goal is to run your opponent out of resources and deck them out. You have that Snorlax with 150 HP with that block, which reads, as long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's active Pokemon cannot retreat. So with the addition of Counter Catcher in this format, you can now Arven for effectively Boss's Orders, which is really what made this deck significantly better. Things like Luxurious Cape as well make your Pokemon have a much higher amount of HP, and if they're not able to one-shot, you can use things like Penny to bring the Pokemon back. So pretty much this deck's goal is just to eventually lock something in the active. You have things like Erica's Invitation, Counter Catcher, as well as things like Echo Horn as well. So you have lots of control over the opponent's side of the board. This deck is great at punishing players who don't necessarily know how to play against it. However, if you play against a skillful player that knows how to play versus the matchup and plays a tech card or two, this deck can really struggle. So I think that's one of the few things that hurts this deck. I think Snorlax is peaking right now because a lot of people don't know how to play against it. But I think as it continues to perform well tournament after tournament, I think people are going to eventually catch on and start to practice a little bit more, or we're going to see most, meta decks potentially play, things like the Minior, things like Professor Toro's Pow Pad, more switch cards and things like that, which might eventually push Snorlax out of the format. So as of right now, I think Snorlax is peaking for the next maybe month or so. I think it makes a fine play for the next, couple upcoming tournaments. I definitely expected to see success, but as it continues to do well, more people are going to tech for it, and then we're likely going to see that success rate start to drop down. So Snorlax is at the peak as of right now. It's just a question of how long it'll stay there. All right, hopping into number 4 here, we have the deck that never seems to die no matter how many people try and tech for it and beat it and how the meta shifts. Mew Vmax is just an incredible deck still. Judge Path is really, really powerful. You could also just put Fusion Mew. I think just Mew in general. I chose not to put, every Lost Zone variant, on this list, as I really just want to showcase the archetypes in general. So you could also put Fusion Mew in this number 4 spot as well. Just Mew in general, I think, is still an incredibly powerful deck as of right now. But we're going to spotlight the DTE Mew variant, as this is the one that has been seeing the most success. Your goal pretty much is just to judge Path over and over again, use things like Grabber as well, and use that Techno Blast or Luxray V's False Snipe to be able to pretty much just blow them out of the game. That Luxray really helps out against things like the Gardevoir matchup. It is very good against Charizard as well, as your entire goal in that matchup is to prevent them from setting up Charizard. Things like Box of Disaster as well really help out against the Charizard matchup and Gardevoir as well. And this deck really does, I think, have the chance at beating most things in the format. It's really consistent and has one of the best engines in the game with that Fusion Strike system. However, the only thing I think holding this deck back as of right now is the risk of Spiritomb. If This deck, kind of similar to Snorlax, continues to top cut every single tournament. More players eventually are just going to get tired of that, and they're just going to start to throw Spiritomb in. There's a reason as to why DTMU wasn't seeing a ton of success right before Paradox Rift came out, and that was because so many people were playing Spiritomb and so many people were just ready for the deck. So as of right now, it's been kind of coasting by because people have been focusing on beating other decks in the format, but as this deck continues to perform well, people's eyes will eventually be turned to it, which makes it a little bit more of a risky play. But as of right now, I think that not enough people are teching for Mew Vmax. They're focusing so much more on decks like Snorlax Stall to beat that I think that this deck definitely makes a great inclusion. I think that more people will be teching Minior in for Snorlax than they will be teching the Spiritomb in for the Mew matchup, if that makes you want to play Mew, then I think that, it's definitely a good deck. So I think as of right now, it's the time to play it. But as time goes on, maybe that starts to change. It's still a great deck, though. All right, hopping into number 3 here, we have Miraidon EX. Miraidon EX most recently won the Toronto Regional Championships, and then the very first event with Paradox Rift Legal, we saw it win the Latin American International Championship. So Miraidon has been on top of the world, and it continues to perform at an exceptionally high level. This is currently the list that I have constructed. One card different from the LAIC winning list. Instead of playing for Ultra Ball, I just play the second Nest Ball instead. Overall, I think this deck is absolutely fantastic, has decent matchups against most things. And yeah, there's not a whole lot to say with the deck. It has answers to most things. I know at the beginning of Paradox Rift, when the set just came out and people were, kind of just testing out, new deck ideas and stuff like that, a lot of people thought this deck was just worse Roaring Moon. But as time went on, people realized just how much more versatile Miraidon is. Yeah, you might do a little bit less damage at times. However, I think that you're still relatively consistent. You have a decent comeback engine as well with things like Iono and Path of the Peak, and you have that big brand new Iron Hands card, which really helps versus some of those more powerful one prize decks. So the deck almost just feels like a more versatile Roaring Moon deck, and it has pretty much answers to most things in the format. Miraidon is at the top of the world right now, and it continues to perform well, and I definitely expect it to continue to see success. It makes a great play for upcoming tournaments, and I definitely think that it's going to continue to perform well. Coming in at number 2 here, we have Charizard EX. Charizard EX is a deck that continues to perform well, doing most recently fantastically at the Brisbane Regional Championships and also the Gdańsk Poland Regional Championship as well. There were, I believe, 2 in top 8 of the Brisbane Regional Championships, and then there were, I believe, 3 or 4 in top 8 of the Gdańsk Regional Championship, it also getting second place at that tournament. Charizard's still amazing. Charizard is a very, very powerful deck as of right now. Really has an out versus most things. It pretty much can go into almost any matchup and say, all right, I have some chance of beating this matchup, or I have some line, which I think is really attractive to players when it comes to picking a deck. As of right now, I've decided to include the Minior and Professor Tauros scenario. Professor Tauros is great to be able to put Minior back into hand, get the energies in discard, then use Super Rod to get the energies back into the deck. It's also really good in the Charizard mirror match. When it becomes a 2-shot war, you're able to Professor Tauros up your Charizard EX and then put it right back down to be able to pretty much just reset all the damage that they just did, pushing them back an entire turn. This is currently on my list for the deck, and it definitely is one of my top choices for upcoming events. I think it has outs to everything, and I think it's really, really strong. Now, the thing about Charizard that makes it so good is that there's multiple different ways to play it. I'm also going to include the Bibarel version also as arguably the second deck. I just think Charizard EX as an archetype is probably, the second best deck in the format. But I also think the Bibarel version is very, very respectable as well. You do trade off not, being, I think, as consistent on that second turn of the game. I think that getting Pidgeot out and getting, the big Charizard up is a little bit more consistent early game. However, Bibarel has that great Iono path protection. And if you're able to get 2 Bibarel out, you're really able to burn through your deck relatively quickly. So overall, I think both of these variants are incredibly powerful, and I expect them to see lots of success moving forward. Charizard has been doing really, really well, and I expect it to continue to see success. Now, let's go on to number 1. Alrighty, number 1 here, we have Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir continues to perform well, and it definitely is, in my opinion, the overall best deck in the format. It has pretty much answers to everything. You can go into any matchup saying that I have some route at being able to beat them, and the deck seems just to be getting stronger and stronger. I've decided to have the VIP pass version as the list I'm going to show. The non-VIP pass version as well, piloted by Kiaran Farr and Jeremy Gibson, getting top 4 and top 8 at LAIC respectively, is also very powerful. But I personally at the moment prefer the VIP passes just because it means you're a little bit stronger if you do prize a Curlier or two, because you're able to get 3 to 4 Ralts down on that first turn a little bit more consistently. Overall, Gardevoir, not a whole lot to say. It has the outs to pretty much any deck in the format. You have Shining Arcana and Zacian, which are meant to take those big KOs. You also have Gardevoir EX, which is a very respectable attacker in some matchups and going to be that engine powering up your attackers. You have things like Cresselia with that Moonglow reverse, which is able to help out a lot versus those Lost Box decks. Screamtail as well, which is just a really powerful card to be able to snipe the bench. Just a really, really good card. Opens up a lot of cool new plays. And you have things like Giratina and Manaphy, which help out versus those damage spread decks. Overall, this deck is absolutely fantastic, and I think it deserves its spot at number 1. And I think it's going to continue to see success, and there's not a whole lot stopping Gardevoir at the moment. Overall, it's the best deck in format, in my opinion. But anyways, that's going to do it for the video today. Let me know what you think of this tier list. Let me know if you think there was a deck that I missed that deserved its spot on here. Let me know. The deck list will be in the comments in the description as well, so make sure to go check that out. And if you're looking for any of these cards, make sure to go check out GameGridSLC.com. The link will be in the description, and you can use my code SmartTCG to get 5% off your next order, and these cards shipped directly to your door. But anyways, that's it for me today. Thank you so much. This is SmartTCG, and I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out. If you're looking to improve your game, I do offer coaching on Metafy. I was ranked in the top 16 ranked players in the world last season, and I know what it takes to improve your game. My students want to combine 3 regionals last year, and I know what it takes to reach that next level. I do offer a free coaching consultation so you can get an idea whether or not coaching works for you. And along with that, I also have a singular sessions, training packages, and more. If you're looking to find out more information, feel free to book that free consultation, or also don't hesitate to shoot me a message on Discord. My Discord will be in the description. All right. Thanks for sitting around and listening to this. I appreciate it. This is SmartTCG. I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out.